New Jersey, July the 19th, 2026. 68 minutes on the clock, one goal already on the board, and a teenager in a red shirt is standing near the touchline, chest heaving, socks rolled down, waiting for the ball to come back into play. He has not slept properly in 3 days. He turned 19 less than a week ago, in the middle of a World Cup semifinal, and the only gift he asked for was the game itself. Now the final whistle is less than half an hour away, and somewhere behind him, in the stands, a 3-year-old boy in a tiny Spain shirt is bouncing on his father's shoulders, too young to understand what he's about to watch his big brother become. Nobody in that stadium needed his name announced, but if you'd asked most of the world just 3 summers earlier who this boy was, almost no one could have told you. Hello, and welcome back to Histolingo. Today, we're going to talk about Lamine Yamal, a name that before the summer of 2023 belonged to nobody outside a working-class neighborhood in Catalonia, and that by the summer of 2026 belonged to football history. This is the story of how a boy who once needed a stool to reach a training cone became, before he had even finished being a teenager, the youngest player ever to win both the European Championship and the World Cup. To understand what Lamine Yamal did, you first have to understand where he came from, because almost nothing about his beginning suggested any of this was coming. He was born on the 13th of July, 2007, in a suburb just outside Barcelona. His father had emigrated from Morocco. His mother's family came from Equatorial Guinea. In the months before his birth, the family faced real financial strain, the kind that doesn't make it into a highlight reel, the kind that simply gets survived 1 week at a time. When his parents chose his name, they gave him 2 words instead of 1. Lamine, meaning the trustworthy. Yamal, a variant of an Arabic name meaning beauty or grace. They weren't naming a future World Cup winner. They were naming a son, in gratitude to the neighbors who had helped carry them through those difficult months. He grew up in Rocafonda, a modest, largely immigrant district of the town of Mataró. Not the kind of postcode that shows up in glossy academy brochures. And yet, if you know where to look, that postcode is stitched into the story forever. We'll come back to that. At 6 years old, playing for a small local club, he was spotted by scouts from an academy most footballers only dream of reaching. At 7, he officially joined FC Barcelona's famed youth system, La Masia, the same institution that had once taken in a shy Argentine boy named Lionel Messi and turned him into the greatest player many had ever seen. In fact, before Lamine could even walk properly as an infant, he had already brushed against that legacy in the strangest way. As a baby, he appeared in a charity photograph, being bathed, quite literally, by Messi himself. Nobody in that room could have known what they were looking at. At La Masia, something became obvious almost immediately. This wasn't just a talented child. This was a child who moved through age categories the way other kids move through school grades, too fast for anyone to really believe it. He was regularly training and playing against boys 3, 4, even 5 years older, and more often than not, he was the best player on the field anyway. By the time Lamine was 15, Barcelona's first team coach had already started inviting him to train with the senior squad. A boy who hadn't even finished his youth contract, sharing a locker room with full internationals. Then came the 29th of April, 2023. Barcelona were playing Real Betis. And with the score already settled at 4-0, the manager turned to the bench and sent on a 15-year-old substitute. Lamine Yamal was 15 years, 9 months, and 16 days old. In doing so, he broke a club record that had stood since 1922, more than a century of history, undone by a teenager who still had homework, technically speaking, to finish. It would have been remarkable enough as a single moment. Instead, it was only the opening line of an extraordinary paragraph. Over the following 2 seasons, he kept breaking records. Youngest goal scorer in Spain's top league, youngest player to reach 50 appearances, then 100, youngest goal scorer in the fierce rivalry match against Real Madrid. Barcelona won a domestic treble with him in the side. And ahead of one new season, the club made a decision that told you everything about how they saw his future. They gave him the number 10, the number Messi had worn for the better part of 2 decades at that club. It is not a number handed out lightly, and it is not a number a club gives to a player they see as merely promising. But even that wasn't the biggest stage yet. In September 2023, still 16, Yamal made his debut for the full Spanish national team and scored in a 7-1 win, becoming Spain's youngest ever international goal scorer. And this is where the story really turns. None of that had prepared the wider footballing world for what was about to happen at Euro 2024. He started that tournament as, technically, a supporting piece. A gifted teenager included more for potential than for certainty. By the end of it, he had become the youngest player ever to appear at a European Championship, the youngest player ever to appear in a major tournament final, and Spain had won the whole thing. He was 16. Most of his classmates, had he still been sitting in a normal classroom, would have been worrying about exams. Still, there is a strange thing about extraordinary teenagers. The world tends to expect them to simply keep rising in a straight line. Real careers rarely work that way. What the highlight reels don't show you, in between one triumph and the next, is a body that was being asked to carry an adult's workload while still growing into an adult's frame. Through 2025, Yamal was repeatedly sidelined by a recurring groin injury, the kind of unglamorous nagging problem that doesn't trend online, but quietly threatens a career built on explosive first touches and sudden changes of direction. He would return, play through pain, break down again. At one point, his own club's manager voiced frustration about how his body was being managed between club and country, a small human crack in the story of an otherwise unstoppable rise, and a reminder that no matter how special the talent, the body underneath it is still just a young man's body, still learning its own limits. He kept playing anyway, not recklessly, but with the quiet stubbornness of someone who had already learned from a very young age that opportunities like this one don't wait for you to be fully ready. And then came the summer of 2026. The World Cup, hosted across the United States, Mexico, and Canada, was always going to be different from the Euros. Bigger stage, heavier expectations, and this time, nobody was calling him a surprise. He was the headline before the tournament had even begun. Early in the group stage, against Saudi Arabia, he scored, becoming the youngest Spanish player in history to find the net at a World Cup, edging out a scoring record that had until then belonged to 2 of the greatest players the sport has ever produced. Alongside a fellow teenage teammate, he later started a World Cup knockout match, the first pair of teenagers to do that for any nation since a legendary Brazilian duo in 1958. But the tournament tested him too. There were matches where the weight of expectation seemed to sit heavier on his shoulders than the ball ever did. Nights where the brilliance came in flashes rather than in full command. No one could have known, watching those quieter performances, that the story was simply saving its loudest chapter for last. On his 19th birthday, the day before Spain's semifinal against France, a journalist asked him, half joking, what he wanted as a gift. He said the only gift he wanted was a win the next day and a trip to New York. Spain beat France. He got his trip, which brings us back to where we began. The final against Argentina. A tight, tense, defensively disciplined match that stayed level for long stretches before Spain finally broke through 1-0 and held on. When the final whistle blew, Lamine Yamal was a World Cup champion. At 19 years old, just days past his birthday, the youngest player in history to have won both the European Championship and the World Cup. His own words afterward were simple, almost shy for a moment this enormous. He said he'd almost completed the set. Not a boast, barely even a celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement from someone who still, in some ways, sounds like a boy talking about a school trophy cabinet. And then his little brother ran onto the pitch, 3 years old, in his own tiny kit, sprinting across the grass into his arms, oblivious to World Cups and history books and postal codes, caring only that his big brother was there to catch him. It became one of the enduring images of the tournament. Not the trophy lift, not the medal ceremony, but two brothers, 29 years apart from their family's beginnings, standing on a football pitch in New Jersey. Now, let's go back to that detail we promised to return to. Rocafonda, the modest Mataró neighborhood where he grew up. Every time Lamine Yamal scores a goal, he performs a small hand gesture. He crosses his hands over his chest and forms 3 numbers with his fingers. 304. Not a message to a girlfriend, not a tribute to a sponsor. 304 are the final digits of Rocafonda's postal code. Every single time, the whole football world watches him celebrate. In a Clásico, in a European final, in a World Cup final, he is quietly pointing back to the neighborhood that most football academies would have overlooked. He never stops signing his name with the place he came from. That, in the end, might be the truest thing about this story. Not the records, though there were dozens of them. Not the trophies, though by 19 he already had more than most players collect in a lifetime. It's that a boy who could have let La Masia and Barcelona and Spain and the whole apparatus of global football rewrite where he belonged, chose instead to carry his own beginning with him onto every pitch he ever played on. Most of us will never break a record. Most of us will never stand on a field with a trophy in our hands while the whole world watches. But most of us do, at some point, get handed a chance far bigger than what we came from. A job, an opportunity, a stage we didn't expect, and have to decide whether to leave our beginnings behind or to keep pointing back to them. Lamine Yamal chose to keep pointing back. He was still a teenager when he did it. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to Histolingo. There are more like it waiting.